of history, this requires really extracting views of history from the medieval world picture, or from the medieval theological and political world picture. Now, the first thing to note is that thinkers and the upper echelons of the church and decision makers who we think of as secular, more or less secular decision makers, such as knights, kings, the emperor, insofar as they think of history, obviously they think of history within a Christian framework. Now, this Christian framework entails that there are various stages of history, or phases that history has passed through. And I've identified 7 of these. There's a certain arbitrariness in my doing this, but we've got to divide it up somehow. Firstly, there's the origin of humanity as described in the book of Genesis. Secondly, there's the period after the creation and after the fall, but before the chosen people or the chosen people. Now, this phase of history is humanity that is lacking in 3 respects, or thought by medievals to be lacking in 3 respects from a Christian point of view. Humanity is without the Word, without the Christian faith, and without the law. Then the third phase of history is the history of the Jews, the chosen people, who don't have the Word, don't have the faith in the Christian sense, but they do live under the law. Now, the fourth phase, or we call it an event, is the coming of Christ, and obviously this is the decisive event in human history from a Christian point of view. And the coming of Christ allows the revision of the law in Christian terms. It allows living for the first time. It allows human beings to live in faith, and it allows knowledge of the Word. Now, the fifth phase is the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, as I was saying last week, we can date the fall of the Roman Empire to 410, or for convenience, we can date the fall of the Roman Empire to 410 AD, because that's when Alaric the Goth sacked Rome. The Goths, there are different kinds of Gothic tribe. They're the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. The Ostrogoths originate roughly from the area we now know as Bulgaria, and the Visigoths occupy the area we now know as the Iberian Peninsula. We can't go into too much detail about that. Alaric the Goth sacks Rome. Now, although we can date the fall of the Roman Empire to 410 in that way, we shouldn't be too historically naive about this, and we can raise the more sophisticated question: did the Roman Empire really fall? And there are 2 respects in which one can argue that the Roman Empire did not really fall. Number 1, the Roman Empire continues as the Byzantine Empire in the East, in the Eastern Mediterranean, centered on Constantinople. And as early as 330 AD, Constantinople becomes the capital of the Roman Empire. It's named after the Emperor Constantine, who, as we'll see, is the first Christian emperor. Constantinople comes from the Greek Konstantinopolis, or city of Constantine. Now, suppose we think that the Roman Empire is the Byzantine Empire, or is continuous with the Byzantine Empire, that there's no real discontinuity here. Well, the Byzantine Empire lasts until 1453 AD. It lasts until 1453, when Constantinople is finally captured and destroyed by the Muslims. Now, viewed in that way, there's no sharp end to the existence of the Roman Empire in 410. It continues in a different guise until 1453. Now, there's a second way of arguing that the Roman Empire did not really fall in 410, and that is that the Roman Empire arguably continues as the Holy Roman Empire, the so-called Holy Roman Empire, which is an essentially German or Central European, or arguably Belgian institution. Now, we can ask the question, well, when does the Holy Roman Empire begin? Officially, in history textbooks, it's often said that the Holy Roman Empire begins in 962 with the crowning of the Emperor Otto I as the first Holy Roman Emperor. But other historians date the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire to 800, when Charlemagne is crowned Emperor of the Franks. But one can, in a sense, understand the Holy Roman Empire as continuous with the Roman Empire if one notes the following dates. For example, Constantine is the first Christian Roman emperor, and he's emperor from 306 to 337. Then in 313, there's legalization of Christian worship throughout the Roman Empire in 313. And then in 380, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So 30 years earlier than the sack of Rome by Alaric the Goth, Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, if we put these facts together, we can argue that the Roman Empire per se didn't fall in 410, but underwent a pair of radical transformations over centuries from before 410 and into the Middle Ages. Essentially, what I'm saying is that the Roman Empire survives, but as a Christian empire, it used to be a bit of a joke in school that the Holy Roman Empire was not holy, not Roman, and not an empire. Probably just as an aside, perhaps not as an aside, but Gibbon, the 18th century British historian who wrote the multi-volume work History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Gibbon, he attributes the collapse of the Roman Empire to the rise of Christianity. He thinks that Christianity is responsible for the destruction of the Roman Empire, so to speak, from within, by undermining the old pagan beliefs and vestiges of republican institutions and so on. And as we saw when we were talking about St. Augustine, after Alaric the Goth sacked Rome in 410, the sacking or the demise of Rome was widely blamed on giving up paganism or giving up pagan beliefs. Now, we've got a conceptual choice or a philosophical choice here. We can either say, one, the Roman Empire did end in roughly 410, because the Roman Empire is essentially pagan. Or we can say, secondly, the Roman Empire did not end in 410. It continued as a Christian organization. Now, just as an aside, or in brackets, this ambivalence is quite interesting, because if you look outside the history of philosophy, if you look at the writing of Jacques Derrida, the French post-structuralist philosopher, who says he's not a philosopher, we won't bother very much about that actually, particularly the post-structuralist philosopher. His notion of deconstruction has the following two features. Something is something is deconstructed if, one, it's destroyed, and two, it is fulfilled. It is fulfilled. Its true destiny is fulfilled. Now, you might think, as many people used to about Derrida's work, well, how on earth could something be both destroyed and fulfilled? But it seems to me that actually this ambivalence about the Roman Empire is a good example of something we could apply Derrida's notion of deconstruction to. That Christianity is the deconstruction of the Roman Empire. In a sense, it's the abolition of the Roman Empire that would have been recognised by Octavian, or Augustus, or Vespasian, or Nero. It's the destruction of that empire. But on the other hand, perhaps the destiny, certainly the historical outcome of the Roman Empire, is to become Christian. So this ambivalence is captured in Derrida's notion of deconstruction. I must emphasise to you that although Derrida wrote a lot, I don't see anywhere in Derrida's own writing applying his idea to the Roman Empire. He doesn't do that, as far as I can see. I'm taking his idea and applying it to the end of the Roman Empire. I think there are many examples of this sort of thing. In the 1980s, there was a bit of a crisis in the British Labour Party because there was a tendency called the militant tendency within the Labour Party, and these people were more or less Marxists. Well, it wasn't clear whether the militant tendency, the Marxist tendency within the British Labour Party was just going to destroy the Labour Party, split it and ruin its electoral prospects for decades, or whether, on the other hand, it was the true teleology, the true and authentic voice of the Labour Party, the true socialist voice that did not compromise with capitalism. So I'm just saying this notion of deconstruction can be applied to different kinds of phenomena in history. Now, I should say as well that the idea of one empire blurring into another could have more than one application in history. Arnold Toynbee, the 20th century British historian, prefers not to talk about ancient Greece and ancient Rome as separate to one another. He uses one category, which he calls Hellenism. Somebody, not Toynbee because he's dead, but a sort of neo-Toynbee, might look at the British Empire and the power of the United States in the world today and say, well, these are not two disparate phenomena, but there's one thing, call it English-speaking global capitalism or Anglophone global capitalist liberalism or something like that. The relationship between the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire seems to me like that. It's a bit of blurring. Now that was quite a long discussion of the fifth stage of history in medieval times. But this is something that's not clear. It's not clear what's going on in the medieval mind. This ambivalence is in the mind of thinking medieval people. Now, the sixth phase of history will be the temporary reign of the Antichrist. Now, clearly, there's a theological debate even now about who or what the Antichrist is, how much biblical evidence there is for the Antichrist, what it means for something or somebody to be the Antichrist, and so on. But in medieval Europe, they tend to rely on something in the book of John, in John 2, where it said, where John says, quote, the Antichrist is coming. And he goes on to say, from this we know that it is the last hour. From this we know it is the last hour. In other words, the coming of the Antichrist heralds the end of the world, the end of time, the end of history. History will finish soon after the coming of the Antichrist. Medievals thought of this as the temporary reign of the Antichrist. Now, the seventh phase of history is the end of the world and Judgment Day. Now, so there's in judgment, the day of judgment, certain people are consigned to hell and certain people are consigned to heaven. Now, in looking at these two final stages of history, the temporary reign of the Antichrist and the end of the world in Judgment Day, the medievals based their views on the book of Revelation. Some medieval people think that the beast of the earth in Revelation is the Antichrist. Some medieval people think that the beast of the earth comes from the sea is the Antichrist. There's a very interesting book, well, depending where your interests lie, there's a very interesting book by Norman Cohen called The Pursuit of the Millennium. The Pursuit of the Millennium, which is about anarchists and mystics and millenarians in the High Middle Ages who thought that the world was going to end. It gives a tremendous insight into the medieval mind, aspects of the medieval mind. The Pursuit of the Millennium by Norman Cohen. It used to be a Paladin book. I don't know if it's published it now. While we're on this topic, we can say that one of the distinctions between Christianity and paganism is as follows. In Christianity, there's a very sharp distinction between the natural and the supernatural, or at least it's fair to say that in Christianity there's a very sharp distinction between God and creation, even though creation includes heaven, angels, and so on. We could say there are supernatural beings that are created, but nonetheless, in Christianity, the distinction between God on the one hand and the whole of creation on the other is very sharp. Now, in paganism, not just in Roman society, but in Celtic society and Romano-British society, for example, there's often a blurring of this distinction. If one can find archaeological objects, pottery and so on digs, and it's not clear whether what you're looking at is a depiction of something natural, something supernatural, or something that blurs the distinction. The Celts in particular, it seems to me, don't have our sharp distinction between nature and spirituality. Now, having said all that, if you look at Keith Thomas's book, his fat book called Religion and the Decline of Magic, which is a big fat penguin book, Religion and the Decline of Magic by Keith Thomas, he thinks that the blurring of the distinction between nature and supernature continues throughout the Middle Ages in local folk beliefs, not so much in the church or in the aristocracy, but in the peasantry. Now, if we take this picture of stages of history, there are certain features that stand out. The first feature that stands out is that the medievals think that history is linear, not cyclical. Now we can draw a distinction between three views of history here. Number one, cyclical. Now the ancient Greeks and Greek and Roman historians, by and large, think that history is cyclical. If we go back to Herodotus and Thucydides and Polybius and Livy, they think that roughly the same sorts of thing are going to happen over and over again. But the second view, on which history is linear, these views, these episodes or stages in the medieval Christian view are not repeatable. They're not repeatable. They'll only happen once. And the third view of history which are called the Renaissance, which is the Renaissance view, we could call a nostalgic view of history, because in the Renaissance, 13th, 14th, 15th century Italy spreading elsewhere, in the Renaissance there's a revival of Hellenistic civilization and, in a way, Hellenistic politics. The fighting between the North Italian city-states in the 14th and 15th century is quite comparable to the fighting between the various states in ancient Greece in the 5th century BC, Sparta, Corinth, Thrace, Athens, well, Siena, Florence, Verona, and so on, are engaged in a similar sort of competition, partly mercantile, but often bloody. Now, so you've got three broad pictures of history. The ancient Hellenistic view, according to which it's cyclical, the medieval Christian view, according to which history is linear, and the Renaissance view, where there was, so to speak, a golden age of Greece and Rome, which they, the North Italian city-states, are trying to restore or revive. Now, obviously, one can say one can see elements of each of these views of history in the other. None of the three is a pure view. I mean, if the Renaissance succeeds, there will be a sort of cycle or repetition, won't there? And so on. Now, I should mention, just an aside here, that the expression Middle Ages, is itself a Renaissance concept or a Renaissance idea, coined in northern Italy towards, I don't know in which century this way of thinking came into being, but you can notice it by the 15th century, 16th century. And by the Middle Ages, the Renaissance meant the period between two Hellenistic phases of history. The Middle Ages are the Middle Ages because they're between two periods of Hellenism. So when we talk about the Middle Ages, we've inherited this Renaissance picture. Now, I could say, to contrast with the medieval Christian view, I should just very briefly say something about Polybius, the ancient Greek historian who lived in Italy from 200 to 117 BC, and wrote about the Punic Wars, the wars between Carthage on the one hand and Rome on the other, which lasted from 264 to 146 BC. Now, if we look at Polybius, he draws a distinction between the following three kinds of government. Number one, monarchy. Number two, aristocracy. And number three, democracy. Monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. He inherits this taxonomy from Plato and Aristotle. And both in Plato and in Aristotle there are refinements which we needn't immediately consider, for example, oligarchy and tyranny, put those in brackets. But Polybius is also concerned with anarchy. Now, Polybius thinks that history goes through cycles from anarchy to monarchy, from monarchy to aristocracy, from aristocracy to democracy, and from democracy back to anarchy. Polybius thinks this pattern is repeated, and he doesn't use this expression, but this is really the motor of human history. Now, there are various reasons why these transitions take place. Anarchy is caused by extreme democracy, but can also be caused by famine, flood, plague, natural disasters. Monarchy is the centralization of power to cure the devastation caused by anarchy. Aristocracy replaces monarchy because power centers grow within a society. Groups economically defined within society become powerful, and they want a political expression for their economic power. And this tends to lead to the overturning of monarchy and the emergence of aristocracy. And the same sort of principle brings about democracy, the widening of political and economic power to larger sections of the population overthrows the aristocracy, and then that generates into anarchy. Now, I'm telling you about this because there's really a very sharp contrast here between this repetitive structure in Polybius, inherited from Plato and Aristotle, and the rather linear view of history, which I've described as medieval and Christian. Now, I think that the medieval picture of history relies on answering some philosophical questions, or the medieval picture of history relies on philosophical assumptions, which are questionable, or we can raise philosophical questions about the medieval picture of history. Now, I've identified 6 of these questions again. We could divide the subject up in other ways. Now, the first question is, does God exist? Because obviously the existence of God in medieval Christianity is a necessary condition for the existence of history, and a necessary condition for the end of history, the way in which history ends. Now, you could say, well, it isn't really, but they believe that it is, and if you were to deny the existence of God, you'd have to have some sort of view according to which history emerges from the natural universe, some epiphenomenalist view according to which history is a product of the natural world, somehow a product of the planet. Now, of course, in Christianity, God is the cause of the universe, not just the subsection that we know as history. God is the cause of time and everything in time. Now, just very, very briefly, is there any reason why we should think that there is a God? Well, on this, I'm inclined to say that the universe, including history, either has a cause or it has no cause. These are the only 2 possibilities. Either there's a cause of the universe or there's no cause of the universe. Now, suppose there is a cause of the universe, then either the universe is the cause of itself, or the universe is caused by something other than itself. Now, I think there are all sorts of difficulties in saying that the universe is the cause of itself. I can't list all these now, but for example, if causes predate their effects, then the universe would have to predate itself in order to be the cause of itself. But if it predated itself, it would already exist. Its efforts would be superfluous. If it does not predate itself, it just is, and we've not explained why it is. So turning to the idea that there's a cause outside the universe, the cause of the universe cannot have the properties of the universe. It's not impossible that one universe causes another, but in that case there's more than one universe, and we want to know what caused these universes, this plurality of universes. So the whatever causes the universe can't have the features of the universe. So whatever caused the universe can't be in space-time. Whatever caused the universe can't be space-time. Whatever caused the universe can't be physical. Clearly, whatever caused the universe must have been or be of inordinate power. And the more one packs these features into the cause of the universe, the more the universe looks as though it was caused by God. That's a very brief sketch of why it's rational to think that the universe and history is caused by God. Now, the second problem that's given rise to by this medieval history, this picture of history, is the problem of free will and divine foreknowledge. The problem is that God is omniscient, and yet God has given you and me free will. Now, these two claims seem to be in conflict, because if God knows that I will do X in 10 minutes' time, it doesn't seem to be any sort of option for me to do anything other than X in 10 minutes' time. Right? In other words, if God knows that P, then possibly not P, where P is some claim about human action. But that seems to rule out free will, because free will requires P, but possibly not P, or the possibility of not doing whatever it is you do. Now, I don't think this problem is utterly insoluble either. I think the key to understanding this problem is that if you had chosen otherwise, or if you choose otherwise, God would have known something else. If you chose otherwise, or if you choose otherwise, God would have known something else. God would have known something different. It seems to me as well that the problem doesn't just arise about God. If you, through some strange mechanism, know what I'm going to do in 10 minutes' time, prima facie, I can't not do it. The problem doesn't so much arise because of God. The problem arises because knowledge is truth entailing. Knowledge is truth entailing. If somebody knows that P, then P. Right? If K, it's P, then P. That's why there seems to be a problem. But all we have to say about that is that if not P, then not KX P. If you chose otherwise, God would have known something different. Now, the third philosophical question that seems to arise out of this picture of history is, did time begin? Did time begin? That time began seems to be a necessary condition for the truth of the account in Genesis. The fourth problem that arises is, will time end? Which seems to be a necessary condition for the truth of the last judgment. Will time end? Now, these are quite difficult problems, will time begin and will time end. But with regard to will time end, we should note that we have got to now, or we have arrived at now. So that question, did time begin, revolves around the issue of whether we could have arrived at the present if a present event has an infinite number of predecessors, whether an infinite number of necessary conditions for a particular event could all be met or all be fulfilled. Now, obviously, the negative numbers could be used prima facie as a mapping onto past events, and the negative numbers form an infinite number series. There's not a problem about that. If there is a problem, it's a problem about an infinite number of events all being over, and now an event happens, or there's something that an event consists in to happen now. It's harder to show that time will end, or suggest an argument that time will end, because prima facie, any event could have a successor event, but nonetheless, answering the question that way is a necessary condition for the truth of this Christian world picture. Fifthly, it seems that on this view of history, God is the ultimate authority on morality. And of course, this is widely doubted by modern atheistic philosophers, for example, Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre, the atheistic existentialist philosophers, think that morality is a human invention and moral codes are the result of human choices. So one would have to refute that atheistic view, philosophically, I mean, to show that God is the ultimate authority. I think one could make a start by saying that, well, there is something transcendent about morality, about goodness, that the world as we know it contains many facts, or if we don't like an ontology of facts, many objects and events. But an empirical scrutiny doesn't seem to show up goodness, or for that matter, evil. These seem to be transcendent. In other words, there seems to be, as Hume suggested, a logical gap or a logical gulf between it is and it ought to be, or between it is and it ought not to be. Now, all I'm saying is that this, in a way, means that morality and immorality are categories which transcend the empirical world, or are not straightforwardly empirical. It's a long way from this to saying that they're properties of God, but this is the direction in which a medieval would think. And finally, and sixthly, there has to be a distinction between appearance in time and timeless reality. Appearance in time is what human beings deal with in history, appearances in time. But reality, God, in God's own nature, is ultimately timeless. Now, this distinction is necessary for the medieval Christian world picture, but it's also necessary for the truth of revelation, because revelation, in a way, is the transition from time to timelessness, or it's a kind of ending of time, depending on how you read it. Now, in medieval thought, there's considerable discussion of peace, the possibility of peace, as opposed to war. I was once asked by the Australian theologian John O'Neill, who's dead now, is there fighting in heaven? Is there fighting in heaven? So I said, well, of course not. It's peaceful. So John O'Neill pulled out the book of Revelation and put his finger on the word polemos. Polemos, war or strife, or possibly brawling. There's brawling in heaven. Now, I must say, I was surprised, but it's the medieval view that God is peace. God is peace, and there might not be utter and complete peace in heaven. So peace is only found in the timelessness of God and the being of God, not even in heaven, which is part of creation. Now, I don't know how much of this to tell you about. Now, all that's really about stages of history, according to the medieval world picture. Now, I'll say something now about theories of law and government in the Middle Ages. Now, when I started studying this around about 1973, I thought it was going to be boring. law and government in the Middle Ages, but it's one of the most interesting things I've ever studied. It's a different world. It's a different world from the world of global capitalist liberalism and materialism that we're socialised into today. Now, the best book I ever read on this is by Walter Ullmann. It's on the reading list. Ullmann, U-L-L-M-A-N-N, Walter Ullmann, who was a German historian of political thought and ideas who worked in Cambridge, England, for most of his life. Now, Walter Ullmann's book is called A History of Political Thought, the Middle Ages. A History of Political Thought, the Middle Ages. It's a Pelican book, i.e. penguin, blue spine Pelican book. A History of Political Thought in the Middle Ages. Or in some versions it's called the Pelican History of Political Thought, the Middle Ages. It's a densely written and fascinating book. Now, he's the best source really for law and government in the Middle Ages, I think. Now, the point is, we need to draw a distinction between two theories of government, ascending and descending. Now, the ascending theory of government is roughly the theory of government that's been taken for granted increasingly in Britain, Europe, and the United States over the last 300, 400, 500 years. The ascending theory of government is the theory of government of the West since the Renaissance. But the descending theory of government is the medieval Christian theory of government. Now, I'll take the ascending theory first. There are various points. Number one, power resides in the people. Number two, power is delegated to the king by the people. I mean, the king, the prime minister or president or whatever. Power is delegated to the king by the people. Number three, the king may only be legitimately removed by the will of the people. Fourthly, we could call this democracy or populism. And fifthly, this ascending theory of government is based on inductive logic, or you think inductively to arrive at it. Examples of the ascending theory of government in practice include A, ancient Athens, and B, the UK, the US, European states today. Now, turning to the descending theory of government, firstly, power resides in God. If you look at St. Paul, Romans 13, St. Paul says, there is no power but God's. And he also says, the powers that be are ordained by God. Romans 13. The second point is that in the descending theory, power is delegated by God to the king. In other words, the king is lent power by God. In other words, the population is entrusted by God to the care of the king. The third point is that power is delegated by the king to the aristocracy. Power is delegated by the king to the aristocracy. Now, by the aristocracy here is meant the military landowners of feudal society, the knights and barons and squires, who both own land and have military equipment, a military role. And of course, feudalism, we can put as an aside, feudalism is a contractual theory according to which there's land ownership in exchange for military service, land ownership in exchange for military service. In other layers of feudalism, there's land tenure in exchange for military service. The fourth point in the descending theory is that the king may only be legitimately removed by the will of God. So even into modernity, Charles I thinks, before the English Civil War, or during the English Civil War, thinks that he rules and can only be removed by God. The fifth point is that this descending theory is best called theocracy, or rule of God, or rule by God. Sixthly, the descending theory is based on deductive logic. Now, I can give you examples of the descending theory. Western Christendom in the Middle Ages is an example of the descending theory implemented, but also the Germanic tribes, which arguably destroyed the Roman Empire, have this descending system. Now, it seems to me that since the Middle Ages, the history of the West is essentially three things. Number one, the replacement of the descending theory by the ascending theory. In other words, the last 500 or 600, 700 years increasingly have seen the replacing of the descending theory by the ascending theory. In other words, the replacing of theocracy by democracy. Secondly, the history of the West since the Middle Ages, it seems to me, has seen the replacement of Western Christendom, or the disintegration of Western Christendom, and its replacement by A, nation states, and B, global capitalism. Now, in the Middle Ages, there aren't really nation states, or the idea of a nation state, the idea of a place called England and a distinct place called France, emerges in a recognisably modern form, really during the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, depending on what you count as the 100 Years' War. But of course, up to a point, the Middle Ages has inherited the shadow of Roman provinces, Germania, Gallia, Hispania, Iberia, Britannia, Caledonia, Dalmatia, and so on, right? Or the zones of the Roman Empire. But in the High Middle Ages, the two salient political units are, first of all, Western Christendom itself. Western Christendom is the baptized. And secondly, the other unit is the fief, F-I-E-F, an area of land partly, well, defined in feudal terms, an area of land defined through military obligation to the king. Now, the third massive and salient development since the Middle Ages, it seems to me, is the development of science in technology. Now, there's a good recent literature showing that the medievals had plenty of science, and medieval monks, Christian brothers in particular, were pioneers in scientific matters. But what characterises modernity since the Renaissance is the deployment of science in technology, the deployment in science and the conquest of nature. So it seems to me we've got three things. We've got the ascending theory replacing the descending theory. We've got the replacement of Western Christendom by nation states, and then by global capitalism. We're living through the end of the era of the nation state, and we're entering into the era of global capitalism, which requires multiculturalism instead of the nation state. And the third thing is the deployment of science in technology. Now, these three tendencies, it seems to me, are combined in global capitalist liberalism, which is the prevailing ideology of the West. Now, Ullman, I think his book is a brilliant book, but he thinks that there's a certain retrospective falsification in our understanding of the Middle Ages. He thinks there's a retrospective falsification involved in the idea that in the Middle Ages there's a conflict between church and state, a conflict between church and state. If we read earlier historians, there's a lot of writing about conflict between church and state. Henry VIII can't get a divorce because the Pope won't authorise his divorce, but the Pope would have authorised his divorce had the Pope not been the prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor. This sort of thing. Now, Ullman says, this is in the book I just mentioned to you, the very term political did not enter the vocabulary of governments and writers before the 13th century, i.e. before the 1200s. The very term political did not enter the vocabulary of governments and writers before the 13th century. In other words, Ullman thinks that the medieval world is so saturated with Christianity that it's an anachronistic mistake to separate the political from the Christian. It's to impose our worldview retrospectively, where there seems to be some sort of atheistic choice, agnostic choice, and Christian or other religious choice. Actually, the population is trying to more or less live a Christian life. The clergy are trying to imitate the life of Christ. But I think Ullman is a great writer about the Middle Ages, but I think in a way he exaggerates here in two ways when he says the very term political did not enter into the vocabulary of governments. For example, in ancient Greece, as you no doubt know, the word for the city-state is polis, P-O-L-I-S. And as you no doubt know, Plato's Republic, the word in Greek is politia. Okay? So, in a way, it would be wrong to quibble about the word. There is the notion of politics inherited from ancient Greece in the Middle Ages. The second thing I'd say is that there is a conflict between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor intermittently throughout the Middle Ages. So if we don't want to call this a conflict between church and state, it's certainly a conflict between something and something. And I think it's best construed as a struggle for sovereignty over Western Christendom. Sovereignty over Western Christendom. But of course, the Pope argues from Matthew 16, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." Christ entrusts Peter with the church. "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." And the popes are the successors of St. Peter. Successive popes do not derive their authority from previous popes. Each successive pope derives authority from St. Peter. who derives his authority from Christ. But crucially, if you read on in Matthew 16, Christ says to Peter, I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound on heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. In other words, St. Peter and the popes don't just have authority over the church, they have authority over the state as well. The Pope has authority over the Holy Roman Emperor, not just over the baptized, not just over Western Christendom. Okay, I'll stop at this point.